Welcome to Dreamers to Leaders, Keeping It Real with Melody podcast. Melody is a born dreamer who started from being a flight attendant and worked her way up into now a tech fashion trendsetter, thought leader, and seasoned entrepreneur in multiple successful ventures. This podcast is for the awakened dreamer. Industry icons will share their humble beginnings up to the leaders they are today. Let's all learn and be inspired. Together, we can all prosper.
Hello and welcome to the Dreamers to Leaders podcast. It's the podcast for the dreamers and more importantly, the doers. I'm your host, Melody. Together, we will explore how business leaders think, act, and speak big as they transition in life from being a dreamer to remarkable leaders. In today's episode, we will tackle how to overcome our unconscious biases to help us flourish and win in this super highly hyper competitive workplace. Joining us here today is Kelly Watson. She has over 25 years experience as a leadership consultant. She co-authored 2 leadership books, namely The Orange Line, a women's guide to integration of career, family, and life. And the second book is called The Next Step, How to Overcome Gender Stereotypes and Build Strong Organization. She is also a part-time instructor at the Executive MBA program at the Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, California, where she also graduated for her MBA. She's also working on her PhD at the University of Denver. She is a managing partner at the Orange Growth Consulting, which is a women-owned business consultancy that specializes in research-based leadership development and removal of biases. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Kelly Watson. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right. So let's begin. If you could take us back to the time when you started and you stumbled into this career path of specializing in diversity and inclusion in the workplace. How was that journey like for you, Kelly?
Well, that's a great question. I was in a corporate career and, a woman navigating through the ranks, and I worked my way to vice president by the time I was 30. And then I had a child and then another one and then a third one. And that really sort of derailed my career from a personal perspective, or at least my corporate world career. So I guess I come to it naturally by having experienced some of the barriers that exist. And then, transitioned over and started doing this work with a colleague of mine who I met probably 15 years now, and my business partner. And she and I, we're both really passionate about this, both had similar career experiences in corporate America. And we just started working together and thought, how can we solve this problem of women, losing women to the workforce and losing, voices at the top that, are obviously competent and hardworking and all those great things. And so we just started collaborating. We did a study that we thought would, maybe be a conference or something that we would present at, and it turned into a book. And then we started working together with companies, and that turned into a second book. So here we are.
Nice. So basically 3 kids while working, right? So, so how was that? How was that juggle for you? Did you feel that you had more of a struggle or a challenge compared to what your husband had to endure throughout that time that you were growing your family?
Yes, absolutely. I will admit I had bought into a lot of the gender roles. And so, and being a type A personality and a bit of a perfectionist, I threw myself in with 2 feet all in on the kid thing from the time I was pregnant, And I think that is one of the things that we've identified that helps derail women is not just what the external environment offers, but really women's attitudes about having children. It's, I went from someone who was, all in on career to being all in on 2 full-time jobs, essentially, with the kids and everything. And there were many things that roles I took on that I didn't even question, things I did for the kids that I didn't even question as to whether or not would be important or necessary. It was just how it's done, or at least how I perceived it was done. And so when I set myself up in many ways for a lot of the barriers that happened. Now, it was completely reinforced by having a fabulous husband who was so supportive and was saying things like, well, whatever you need, what do you need? And, when I wanted to take some time off, he was all in for that. So I think, I think that the barriers, certainly there are external biases that happen for women and people who, I tell the story that when I was up for a promotion to director when I got pregnant with my first child, and was getting closer and closer to maternity leave. And I kept pushing for my promotion. That was really, something that, I'd kind of gone through all the hoops that you were supposed to go through. And I was told, well, just wait and see what happens when you come back from maternity leave. Just wait and see, because you may feel differently. And so then when I came back, I started pushing for it again. And it was, well, just give it some time. You've just come back, you're not getting full night's sleep and everything else. And so there were definitely external forces that were reinforcing, my own beliefs. But then there were my own beliefs that, I'm the one who has to get up for all those nighttime feedings, and that I'm the one who exclusively has to take the children to doctor's appointments and all of that. And really, I think in many ways that was the insight that helped drive our first book about career-life balance, is that, a lot of it is questioning some of those gendered assumptions about what women are supposed to do. And I think if somebody had said out loud to me, did you go to college to get married so that you could stay at home? I would have said absolutely not. And yet when you get there and, you've got these kids in there, and it is very demanding and it is very hard, you sort of don't even question, well, should I quit? Should I stay at home? What's the situation? And I think that's part of the problem, right?
Right. So you're extremely lucky to have a partner that supported you, right, throughout all the tasks that need to be addressed during that time. And as we know, being a mother is a full-time career. So technically there are 2 major things that demand so much of your energy, time, effort, and whatnot. And interestingly enough, I think there was an article that was featured where you were interviewed, right, at the I think it was the San Gabriel Tribune back in 2017, where it also talks about gender pay disparity, right? And you mentioned how it is when a man starts a family, somehow corporate America would give that gentleman a raise. But if it's the women, conversely, it'll be either a downgrade in pay because of that perception that, the worker would be distracted or would be not working, for the most part. So how do you think that could be solved? Even that unconscious bias, right?
It's more than that, right? It's that, when a guy has a kid, they assume he's more committed to the organization now because he's got to be the provider, and that's the male, the gendered role that we have for male is that he must provide. And so he needs more money. And a woman, especially if she's a leader, it's, oh, well, wait a minute. She can't lead now that she's distracted because she's less committed. She's less embedded in her career. And that's because she's going to all of a sudden spend all this time at home. So it starts with that assumption. And then the pay follows that says, well, if you had a team and you were supervising people, we're going to take that away. And a lot of women, of course, have bought into this. So then they kind of go part-time, and then, they basically do the same job they were doing before, but they give themselves a pay decrease because they feel guilty that they're not working, 70 hours a week anymore. which is really silly too. I always tell women, don't take the pay decrease. Just, it's okay to work 40 hours.
Right,
That's actually
right.
for a few years while you're getting yourself, on your plate. But, I want to go back to what you were talking about the supportive husband, because I said that, a little bit in fun at the beginning, that it was actually my husband's support and our doubling down on the gender roles that really created some of our problems in the beginning, because, it just sort of was unspoken that we were following these assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But he's actually come a long way to being, truly a partner in parenting. And, he says it's because he doesn't want to end up in one of my books. But hey, if that's the motivation, that's good. But no, we've come along on this journey to where really he truly is a partner at home, because he realizes a number of things. First of all, that we're both parents and that we both love our kids, number one, and career comes second to our family in both cases. But he has a very high power career. He is a C-level executive himself. So then the question becomes, well, how do we get it done when there are two of us in the household that have high level careers? And his mentality is, look, that I am a benefit to his career because I am working, because we have similar organizational experiences, and I become a de facto consultant for his business in many ways, and vice versa. So we get the benefit of having each other as a coach and as a consultant, where if I was not working and didn't have that workplace context, he would not have that experience to bring to his employer. So he sees it as a benefit, but he recognizes that, this family life is can be taxing. So he also is a big supporter in if we don't have to do it, if it doesn't have to be one of us, then we're going to outsource it. And, people will balk and say, well, that's really expensive, but it really isn't. Because first of all, it forces a prioritization. Like, is it really necessary? There's a lot of things being done by women unquestioningly that don't actually have to be done. Bringing all the cupcakes to every single birthday at school, and to doing, just over engineering everything from birthday parties to kids' homework and everything else, which is created, by the way, a system of expectation out there now that is what is necessary for a child to go to school and be successful in the world, which really isn't. And so part of it's a prioritization, and then part of it's also a reflection of the worth that this work is to us. And so if that means we're going to order food delivery service because the cooking of dinner is not something that either of us has the cycles or the energy or wants to spend the energy on, then we find it valuable enough to spend the money to get it done. And it is temporary. That's the other thing, is that, the times that your family needs you come in waves. And then there are plenty of times when everybody can be independent. So now it does create a little bit of, everybody to their own in our house. And people laugh at me because we all do our own laundry. And that's something, even my kids, and as young as when they were in their 7 and 8 years old, they were doing their own laundry. They could throw in their clothes. And what was great about that is if someone left a crayon in the pocket, they were the only ones who suffered from that consequence.
I need to start my little boy in that type of training.
Oh, yeah. And they all know how to do it now. And even my husband does his own laundry, and, that way he's not shrinking my sweaters or doing anything, there are consequences.
Or fading your white tops, right?
That's right. And I'm strangely the only one in my household who washes whites and colors separately. But, again, consequences. That's, certainly everybody was trained appropriately on how to do it, and they chose that was not what they wanted to do. People always, the one thing that's funny about that, I always get the objection that, well, the loads would be too small. And I'm like, well, how it works in our house is people generally do laundry once every couple of weeks. So the loads are the same size.
That's smart. That's your strategy. So basically what I'm hearing, and I agree, it somehow sort of boils down to prioritization, right? And having that heart-to-heart conversation with your support group, your family, your husband, right? And and outsourcing, right? Outsourcing what are tasks that seem mundane, but are definitely still very much essential in running your day-to-day life. So those are,
and I'm not allowing them to become invisible. I think that when things are invisible, there's no value behind them, and people think that it's just magical how things get done, right? So, but if you bring it into the forefront and have a strategic out loud conversation about whose role it is and who's going to do it, now it's not invisible. So at least if you've conceded that, okay, I'm going to be the one that takes out the trash, that's great, because now it's on the list of something that's recognized that you're doing. So I think that, it's in many ways about just not accepting gender roles as written in stone, having out loud conversations, and then making the decision, is that worth it for our family to do? And if so, who's going to do it?
Right. So you mentioned the two books that you co-authored. So the first one is The Next Step, right? Next Step, how to overcome gender stereotypes, right? Yeah. And how to build strong organization. Tell me, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, so this one is our second book. This is the one where we took a lot of the consulting work that we've been doing for organizations, and we just lay out what our process is and why. And I think we do cover some of the stuff that we covered in the first book about, women's assumptions and what women can do. But we also have a part about what men can do, and then what the organization can do to really identify the barriers to women and, in full inclusion for people of color as well. And how can we remove them? What are the steps to removing them?
Mm-hmm. So the first book actually is The Orange Line, right?
Yes.
Why is that the title?
Because we envisioned in The Orange Line a career model where, so the orange line is not really a line as much as it's a curve. And that is really that, look, you're going to sometimes be all in at work. If you're an accountant and it's the accounting close, you're going to spend extra hours at work because that's how it has to be. And then there are sometimes, like my daughter was in the hospital last week, as you know, because we were supposed to do this last week. And you know what? That was all her. And there was not so much work. I mean, I was fitting it in the crevices, right? And so that's the orange line. And there are also could be times during your career trajectory where you take a gap or a sabbatical and you take that step back. And that might be because you're battling an illness, or it might be because, your children want to travel. I have a friend who took a year off in his career to take his daughter around the world, and she sang, all over the world because it was part of, supporting her singing career. And, that's an appropriate thing to do. And if you think of your career as an orange line that ebbs and flows as needed and is a long-term career that does not end, then you start to think about these breaks or these things as sabbaticals and as an investment in your future career. And you think about, getting an education, for example, so that you can further your career. You don't think of it as an either or, on or off, and an end. Because here's the dirty secret, for these women who went to college and got on the right track, got an excellent career started, but then allowed themselves to get derailed by family, is that gap ends up being so, because during that gap, they're not necessarily thinking mentally like a sabbatical. They lose track of keeping themselves up to speed with what's happening technology wise or what's, going on in the workplace. They kind of check out. And then when they want to enter again 15 years later, the workplace has no place for them. And now that's partially the problem of the workplace. Absolutely. But if you had instead taken a sabbatical, the mentality is, I've got to keep up my network for work. I've got to keep my mind engaged in the industry. So you're reading things on periodicals on the outside and things, and you're thinking of it as a temporary gap, not a permanent gap. And so I think that that's a big reason why the title of that book was so important and why our model in that case was so important.
Mm-hmm. So basically it has been controversial where people are saying there's no such thing as work-life balance because you really can't balance it to the degree. And your book basically tackles the integration of family life and career. what's your take on the work-life balance situation?
Yes.
So you think that's a myth? Or there is really
Totally.
like a formula that you could crack the code and truly there could be that harmony in one's life?
Right. Well, I don't like the word balance for that reason, because what it does is it puts you on a teeter-totter with you in the middle. And, the analogy of, you've got to, whenever you invest some time over here, you've got to give it up over there. And I also don't love that it's time-based, right? Because it assumes that all actions and all minutes are equal. And that's not the case, right? Like sometimes a little bit of time goes a long way, both on the family side and in the career side. So I like to think that's why we use the words work-life integration, because, you never ask a man how they're balancing work and life, right? Because it's just assumed they have a family. They have, I had a guy ask me one day, I don't know how you do it. You have 3 kids and you work and everything. I said, well, how do you do it? And he said, well, it's different. And I'm like, well, why is it different? That's the problem, is the fact that we think it's different, right? So a guy just integrates it. He just figures it out. And in many cases, that's dependent on, a wife who's doing an unfair share, probably. So let's tackle that and let's understand, because if we can think of it like he has a right to a career and he has a right to a family, but we only allow women to have a right to a career if family's taken care of first. And that's a mentality shift I really want to change. Like, we have a right to a career. We went to school. We invested. We actually graduate more women from colleges these days than men. And so when you look at that, you think, okay, so we did all that investment. We've certainly earned our space at the table in this man's world. So why do we not then have a right to enjoy it and peruse our career and follow our métier, right? Well, I think we do. And I think that what has to shift is this idea that it's an extra and that's something you're privileged to get only if you've taken care of family first. So men have to take care of their families too. And the longer we shelter dad from actual parenting responsibility, the longer this is going to perpetuate. And here's what I will say about the pandemic, because the pandemic is kind of, it's a double-edged sword. On the one side, it was a huge opportunity because we got to prove finally that you don't have to be face to face to get work done, right?
Yeah. That's one upside of the pandemic, right?
Yeah, we proved it. We've been saying it for years, of course, but now we proved it. But on the other side of it, what happened? Well, women left the workforce. They said, well, now we've got to homeschool the kids, and that's too hard to do. And so we saw the biggest exodus of women from workforce participation since the 70s. And we saw 100% of the people who left the workforce in December of 2020 were women. I mean, it is astounding what happened. And it was like, nobody even said, I mean, they complained about it, but nobody said, is this right? Should this be the case? I mean, I honestly think that we're not going to get a change until the men have to do it, until, and if you were a person who said, oh my gosh, the kids are home, they're in front of Zoom, we got to figure this out because I got to go to work. If the men said, hey boss, I got kids running around the background, I need this time, or I need to work for 6 hours today so that I can look after my kids and take a shift from my wife, the world would literally change because they have the problem. But if we just absorb the problem, then nothing's going to change. It's just going to go backwards, which is what most of the media is saying has happened.
So Kelly, you mentioned shift, right? So for many years of you doing, of being a consultant in gender equity and inclusion, in those 2 decades, have you seen a conversational, shift in the workplace? And where do you see this headed? The direction it's going to?
Yeah. I've definitely seen 2 major leaps forward. The first is Me Too. And what Me Too did, and we found this when we were doing the interviews for our book too, is that before Me Too, what was happening was women were experiencing some barriers, a lot of barriers, and not realizing that they weren't the only one. not realizing that our sisters sitting at the cubicle beside us were having the same experiences and the same struggles. And because we didn't talk, we were not empowered and we didn't have, creative solutions. It was these individual battles happening all over the place. And we were sort of almost accepting of this is just the workplace, right? I mean, and then Me Too happens. And I'll never forget, I ended up having a conversation with my sister, who's a major tech salesperson and is just a fabulous professional woman with kids as well. And I talked to her one day. We were just sitting down, having a glass of wine together and talking about, wow, this Me Too phenomena, isn't it crazy? And so we started storytelling and telling about some of the crazy things that had happened to us in the workplace. Like I used to have a VP of HR who would walk around and he'd massage the shoulders of all of the women at work. And we would see him coming out of the corner of our eye and beeline for the bathroom where we'd hide, literally leaving our desks and our work so we could hide from this creep because he was going to make the rounds and he was going to rub our backs for us and everything. And, it's appalling, but it was happening. And then my sister was telling stories of men who'd grab her behind when she was out at, happy hours with them and tell her that, she's given him a vibe, because she's being social and bubbly and everything. And I thought, how many? I didn't even know this. This is my own sister. We talk once a week at least, and we have never shared these stories. So it gave us permission and it opened the door. And finally we had also some legal support where, the perpetrators were being identified and called out and received some consequences. Now, the backlash against that was, now we're going to have all these women with their false claims and everything else, which of course has not actually happened, but that was the big fear that all of this was going to be, nonsense. And we've pushed through, I feel like, a massive big leap where even, in some of the work we're doing in organizations where we ask, is there blatant harassment happening? And we're getting so few reports now of actual harassment, like blatant stuff. Now there's all kinds of microaggressions and everything else. That's another story. But I think that going from an environment where we had all accepted that it was a daily occurrence and that it was normal and that boys will just be boys and that's what we have to expect if we're going to be in their world, to now starting to realize that is inappropriate behavior and whether men are adjusting their behavior out of fear of Me Too or whether there's been, an increase in understanding that even innocuous behaviors like sexist jokes are not actually helpful and appropriate in the environment. It's absolutely created a better environment and more empowerment for women in this environment. So then the second big move, obviously, was Black Lives Matter, which I think has a lot of the same characteristics, a lot of individual stories happening where, and I won't say that African Americans weren't talking about the problem of, police shootings and, inappropriate behavior by police, but also the inappropriate microaggressions in the workplace. But I definitely feel like Black Lives Matter opened it up to where everybody was talking about, look at this. This is a problem. And this is a situation in the corporate culture that is unacceptable. And so what we're now seeing a lot of companies that are interested in learning more and finding out how they can eliminate these barriers in the workplace and make the workplace more inclusive by getting rid of things like microaggressions. Now, do we have a long way to go? Absolutely. There's a lot of stuff still happening. But even there, we're seeing a decrease in the amount of blatant, sexism and racism and blatant, people are starting to understand that telling an off-color joke is not just, is not a minor thing. It's a major barrier to inclusion that needs to go from organizations.
Yeah, just like with anything in life, if there's a problem that needs to be solved, it starts with awareness. And I think with the Me Too and the BLM, having that awareness, now people would think 3 to 10 times more before they do what they thought was normal for the longest time. So that seems to be a positive step moving forward. Now, with all the positive things that people know, theoretically, and that we have already kind of have seen, from what gender equity could do to the workplace, how it could positively affect the economy, the employees, and all that. Why do you still think there's still some pushbacks? And or do you still think that there's pushbacks among, the large corporations in America, whether it's passive or active? What do you say on that resistance that's still around?
Yeah, there's definitely still some resistance. I think that the pockets of it are getting smaller, but I do think that and I think that there's a little bit of a pushback, similar to how when Me Too happened, there was a pushback from men saying, well, now I'm going to get falsely accused. I think that there's definitely, pushback on racism from the perspective of people who think are either threatened or think that there isn't a problem, or think that by talking about racism in the workplace that we're now stirring something up that wasn't, that isn't really there. And I'll give you there's an excellent quote from somebody I was talking to earlier today that I want to crystallize because it's so fabulous. He said, the people who have equity can sometimes find it very challenging to see inequity. And I think that really speaks to what our individual experiences are. And I know that as myself, I've certainly felt the inequity as a woman, but I have not felt the inequity of an intersection like race or, sexual identity or even age. I'm starting to feel the age one, but the ageism or ableism and some of these other things. So my experience, while I can, have empathy for other groups, my experience doesn't give me some of those insights. And so it's really easy to dismiss somebody else's experience when you don't have that experience. And so I think that that barrier, and then of course, we've got a political climate that's really sort of, capitalizing. I will say that on both ends of the spectrum, capitalizing on having people wound up against other people. And that I think is kind of creating more of a barrier in the workplace for people to stop and listen and understand each other's perspectives before jumping into a labeling or putting somebody in a bucket, and deciding that that's somebody's an enemy because of what their political party has told them is making somebody an enemy, right? And so I think that we still have some big growth to do as people from that perspective.
So there is so for the society and on the humanitarian level, it's good to have that gender equity and diversity inclusion, right? But for a corporation, what do you see has been the positive impact on their bottom line, on their balance sheet when there is this going on? So that would speak more to, corporate America and to the Fortune 500, who wants to make sure that they have good reporting to their shareholders every time they have to report, right? So what has been that concretely helps a corporation when that problem is solved, when gender equity is there and diversity inclusion is there?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, there's a lot of literature being built on this right now, where there are a ton of studies that are showing the impact to innovation, that we're more innovative when we have more diverse minds at the table coming up with ideas, that having more equity, gender equity and balance on your board has a better impact on your financial results, certainly representing your customer base more fully, that you seeing yourself reflected in products. I mean, there's a book out called Invisible Women that talks about what happens when women aren't at the table making decisions on the products that we choose, the way we design cities. I sit on a project in my community where we were designing the pool. And a lot of the architects and design firms were all white men. And it's amazing that one of the designs came back and it had the men's bathroom and change area larger than the women's at the community pool. And I thought, okay, do we know who uses the pool? Because I use the pool and I know what it was like to bring kids to the pool. And I didn't sense that the men's change room was too small. So, it's kind of one of those interesting things. And you think about how many things in society have been designed this way. Seatbelts kill women and children. And why? Well, because the average human is male. If you take an average of all the weights and, height and everything else, the average in that is still a man. So, we get dropped off the spectrum on a lot of those, how drugs are designed and, even think of the average dose of a Tylenol, right? I take the same one as my husband does, really. And he's, probably got 50 pounds on me at least. So that doesn't make sense. Right. But that's been, and my big worry is Silicon Valley, because by not having women at the table designing artificial intelligence and designing the robots and designing the tech that we're going to live by, what is being lost?
What's interesting with what you're saying is years back, I read an article on how it is that with feminine products, sanitary products, contraceptives, there's just a few women, if not all majority men, that are designing this for women. So it's just mind-boggling, come to think of it. But yes, having that, for a corporation, knowing your consumer, considering half of the world's population, half of the world's consumer are more than half are women, right?
Yeah.
So those are very good points. You also touched on the pandemic, and as we know, there's a lot of people that have been forced out of work because of the shutdown and this pandemic. More so with women of color, right? So do you see this more as a temporary setback, or do you see it moving beyond post-pandemic?
Yeah, I don't see how, given the science of how viruses work, that this is something that's going to go away anytime soon. So I think in terms of the virus and continuing to spread, I think we definitely have a long curve ahead. Now, we have the technology to protect workers and to get them back to work, but we've chosen to have a political point of view on whether or not we're going to use that technology. And that's a little problematic, because I do think that is once again disproportionately harming women and women of color in how that has been sort of presented to us as a society, as the choice that it is. I give the example of my husband was recently in Florida traveling, and nobody is wearing a mask. And nobody is, very few people are vaccinated. Of course, they have a big outbreak right now. And so you think about if the message is choice and, choosing to protect yourself or not, using that information, but nobody's using it, then, I don't know. I have to question if we're doing our population a service by sending out the political messages that we're sending out. Now, there again, we just talked about not having women represented at that table, especially women of color. And if you look at Congress and you look at, local government and you look at state government, women are not there. And we are not in the room when these decisions get made and these petty battles break out about, partisanship. So, and I'm just as much at fault there, because have I, decided that I want to run for office? Absolutely not. But without having women there, I'm part of the problem, because I'm, saying that there are no women there and yet not willing to embark on that career.
So you think that with the women of color being out of work because of the pandemic, you still see that spilling over way past post-pandemic? You think?
There's a couple of forces at play, right? One of them is are we going to continue to have a slowed economy because of the persistence of the virus, or are we going to get it together and be able to be fully open and fully operational because we're protecting people? So that's part one. Part two is, what I'm seeing in the market in terms of labor right now is a big mismatch. There are some industries that cannot fill seats fast enough. There are more jobs than there are people that can fill those seats. But and yet unemployment is high. So when you look at that, you have to say that we have somehow allowed our workforce, our labor force, to end up with the wrong skills and non-mobility, an inability to move across the market. So, and I think it's a big problem. I think schools need to address it. I think that schools need to be doing a better job of serving underserved communities. And I know that traditionally hasn't been the case. I think that the entire way we recruit students, and but these are big systemic issues that I think are kind of next on our list to solve, right?
One of the reasons why I don't really watch news, TV for that matter. So one time working out, news was on, right? And it was the same thing that they're playing, but it's so sad. Going back to what you're saying on, there's all these jobs, but not a whole lot of people raising their hands. And all these corporations are putting out like incentives, $1,500, $2,000 to be the cook, to be the server, to be the cleaner, to be the housekeeper of this lodging place or what have you. It's just one after the other of those messages that out there. The jobs are there, right? But why is it that with unemployment rate still high, that there's not a lot of takers? So I think
it may shift when the unemployment runs out. I think there's still some legacy social programs and coverage and unemployment that's preventing some people from working. I heard somewhere that represents about 40% of the people who are out. Not all, but 35 or 40%. And then, there's definitely people who are out because they're nervous about being face to face with customers or being in a workplace where people aren't vaccinated and masked. So I think that there's some of that. And then I do think that there is some real skills mismatch stuff, which has a lot to do with just legacy systematic stuff that I think
that's giving a lot of credit to our workers out there. I think there's a lot that are just freaking lazy. You know what I mean? Like, hey, it's time to get out of your couch and work, people. But yeah, that's a very good angle that you brought. I wasn't really thinking of that, but you know what? You're right. There are some that are truly scared and skeptical of the virus and the Delta and what have you, right? So thank you for enlightening me on that angle. So now let's talk about corporations that are out there that understand now that having diversity would leverage talent that's out there, that they're not just going to confine themselves with a certain demographic, right? What do you think are the major steps that a corporation need to do? So what are the baby steps? What are the first steps that one need to do towards that movement of having the gender equity?
Yeah, great. Well, the first ones I would say is number one, envision what you mean when you say diversity, because in many cases, companies don't have a clear view of what that means. And I liken it to, we want to see different colored faces and different genders, but we don't want anybody to behave any differently or bring any of that. Don't change anything, and that can be problematic because then when you start bringing people in and they start to give their opinion and it's different, then we have a problem, right? Then we have, some conflict that they didn't expect. So part of it is we work with companies to help envision equity and inclusion and what that means for their organization. And then the second thing is to understand the current state and do some deep analysis, understand where the gaps are and where the opportunities are in the organization, where the exact barriers are for your organization. Because what we've seen is a lot of companies are just chucking spaghetti at the wall and hoping that, that they'll be a catch-all. Oh, we're going to do blind resumes. That'll solve our problem. But if your problem isn't in the recruiting pipeline, then, why are you solving? Or some want to do unconscious bias training for the whole company. Well, if it's not the whole company that needs it, you're going to irritate the people who already know, and and then there are the folks who haven't got a clue that may be like, why am I even doing this? So you absolutely need to understand the current state and then identify your gaps. And then the third thing that generally happens is we need to train leaders and embed these inclusion skills in leadership so that leaders are creating that inclusive environment and that they've shored up their skills. And I like to say it this way, that, we've only in the last 5 to 10 years really been concerned as companies and starting to put this into the strategic, and guess what? Some of these leaders got there and were rewarded and incentivized their entire careers and didn't have these skills as one of the important factors, one of the competencies. So if them being clueless about inclusion and about different cultures and about even gender interactions is kind of not their fault. And now we're slapping them hard if they make a mistake and putting labels on it like you're sexist or you're racist. And that's not really fair. So what we really need to do is assess what is the landscape, what are your skills, and get leaders to embark upon this. And it has to be part of their, it has to be something that's recognized as important so that they'll invest in it. But then when you start to show people that this is something we care about and we're going to measure it in you, well, then people are motivated to, step it up. And then we've got to train them. And we got to show them how to do this in a safe way so that they don't get in trouble when they make mistakes.
So Kelly, for our audience out there that wants to know more about your consultancy group, how can they reach you?
Yeah, they can check us out at orangegroveconsulting.com. And our book is on Amazon and at Walmart and everywhere else. It's called The Next Smart Step, How to Overcome Gender Stereotypes and Build a Stronger Organization.
Well, Kelly, that concludes our show. More power to what you do. Again, half of the world's population are women. So what you do really make a difference. So thank you. And wishing you continued success.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
For our audience out there, this is the time for you to pick up your phone, get your phone, and share this episode to anyone that you think would benefit from this program. And for all the dreamers out there, keep believing. You got this. Till next time.